Perfect. Okay, I think that we have started. Please, Jan, you have the control.
Okay, thank you, Corrado. Thank you for inviting me to give this session tonight. I feel honored with such a large public tonight. As you said, I will share my slides after the presentation. You can interrupt me, but I would prefer questions after the presentation, if I may be honest. Let me share my screen. So tonight's topic is digital transformation through collaborative intelligence. The agenda is very straightforward. It's a reflection on digital transformation. How are we thinking about digital transformation? And then bit by bit going to what happens if we work together on digital transformation, and how can you streamline and enhance digital transformation. A lot of what I will be sharing tonight you can find in the book that I wrote together with Otto Lasker, Practices of Dynamic Collaboration. It's a piece of work where a lot of people contributed with ideas, with angles, with critique, with suggestions. I have mentioned a number of them. So the ideas which I will share tonight are ideas inspired by the work of Michel Basseges, Roy Bhaskar, Otto Lasker, Eva Verdelia, Nick Shannon, and Bruno Fischrich, to mention the most important ones. I would like to start with a question. What is digital transformation? And may I ask to put your ID in the chat, just to have an idea on, well, how do we think currently about digital transformation? So may I invite everybody to share their well, answer on the question, what's digital transformation? So that we have a feeling how we collectively think about digital transformation. Digital transformation is agile transformation, the first one. Is modernization of IT working practices. Is developing in a less waterfall way. New revenue streams, that's also an interesting one. What else? Optimizing the way we work through digital applications. Yeah. New digital skills, connecting to our customers. So there is a wide variety of angles. If you search on Google, you will find 473 million hits on digital transformation. So it is really a subject that has lots of definitions. Now, I will share a number of ways to look at, to think about digital transformation. And the first one is a contextual view. If you do a search on Google, you will find a lot of models like the one projected here. Digital transformation is often related to the adoption of digital technologies to transform services or businesses through replacing non-digital or manual processes with digital processes, or replacing older digital technology with newer digital technology. We have seen in the chat several definitions that come very close to this definition. But of course, that's a very instrumental definition. And we can ask ourselves, the question, how is digital transformation part of a broader context? And a number of you referred to an overarching business model of which digital transformation is a part. It can be the disruption of a market model. It can be accelerating growth platforms or transforming even the operating model. So we can think about digital transformation in structural or contextual ways. And by this I mean that you can think about any subject, also digital transformation, from an underlying principle of holism, by which I mean that nothing can be viewed in isolation. If you talk about digital competencies of skills, that's always part of a larger whole. There is always a bigger whole to be considered, and each thing that one looks at is just part of that whole. So this is a model that points to, let's say, a number of parts making part of a larger whole. If you look at your own definition, you can ask yourself where your definition fits in what kind of larger whole you're thinking about. But there is also a second way of thinking about transformation. And this is another model. About 90%, if you look at the first 100 models that you get on Google when you search for digital transformation framework, about 90% of the models that you will find on Google are of this type. A kind of give you a picture of the different variables in a kind of a functional structure without making explicit the relationships between the different variables. So you point here at different aspects of the market model, you point at different dimensions of a possible operating model. And of course, a lot of participants tonight are consultants. You know that there are plenty of different ways to represent the broader context of digital transformation. A second type of models is answering the question, well, how is change occurring? If we think about digital transformation, what is changing? What's the kind of wave that it causes? How does it change over time? And the principle of change is a principle of constant change, by which I mean that you can think about digital transformation in terms of states that are in motion, that are not static, and are always leaving behind something. For example, if you think about digital transformation in this model, which is a model of the Boston Consulting Group, at a certain moment, the opportunistic digital approach is left behind in favor of a centralized approach, which in its turn can be left behind for a hybrid approach, and so on. You can look at your own answer in the chat and ask yourself the question, well, basically, is there something in what I put in the chat that I'm leaving behind? If I, for example, am building digital skills, what am I leaving behind? And what is the process of leaving behind certain skills in the advantage for digital skills? So the process view is a second view you can take on digital transformation. The third view, a third way of thinking, is thinking about relationships. How is one issue shaped by another issue? For example, this is a model from Bain and Company. If they talk about digital transformation, they have selected, let's say, 4 dimensions: data and analytics, systems and technology, talent and culture, and the operating model and partnerships. And they focus a lot on what are the essential relationships between the different components. In a certain sense, they see things as nested in a kind of a network. And by seeing things in a network, you ask yourself questions about the structural relationships. And structural relationships, the underlying principle is that you can look at reality from asking yourself the question, what is it that I can't see apart from digital transformation? What is the common ground? What do I need to take into account in order to build myself a rich picture on the subject or on the issue? The basic idea is that we construct our reality here, as we do with contextual thinking, as we do with process thinking. In the relationship thinking, we construct our reality through the conviction that each and everything is related in some way to everything else. And it is those relationships that give things its essence. I will come back to that in just a minute. The fourth way of thinking is what I call transformational thinking, a transformational view. And basically, that's the question on what are the tensions, the disequilibria, and transformational challenges that an issue provokes, and that help you to make the bridge, in a certain sense, to change the form of something. As you see in the pictures, the page is turned of a desert to a landscape that is very green and very promising. So the form of the landscape is changing. The person diving in the second picture illustrates that transformational approach. If you find an article on, for example, the movement from an assisted digital way of doing things to a digital first way of doing things to a business-driven digital way of doing things, you can discover a view of how things transform, and how things transform, change, move through different forms. That's a different way of thinking compared with the process thinking I just tried to explain. The developmental movement that is typical of transformational thinking is a movement of either transcendence and including in the transcendence previous forms, or it is about regression, collapsing or breaking down or reversing to a previous growth. Basically, my point is digital transformation will only succeed if you have a combination of 4 ways of thinking. And indeed, if you look at success rates of digital transformation, only about 30% of digital transformation efforts actually succeed. That's the best figure that I found, and it came from, I think, the Boston Consulting Group. But only about 5% of the digital transformation investments are getting a moderate or a significant payback. So most of the digital transformation efforts do not lead to the desired results. And one of the things that is key to that is how we build a dialogue on digital transformation. And it begins with the question, well, what do we mean by digital transformation? And participants avoiding even the dialogue to explore the different perspectives on digital transformation. Now, the 4 perspectives that I just introduced, you can consider them as maps. And we all use all kinds of maps. One of the, well, best known map, at least here in Europe, is the map of the London Underground. We know, looking at that map, that the distances and the proportions are not right, but they are incredibly useful to get an orientation. And by using maps, we select things. We take certain things out of it, leave others out, but also put things in. For example, the colors of the lines is something that we put in the map. And at the end, the map determines what we think that is important. So maps are rarely a representation of reality, but a construction of reality. It is how we conceive, how we create reality. And my essential point tonight will be that building collaborative intelligence in digital transformation requires building a very rich picture on digital transformation and the digital transformation efforts. If you use maps insufficiently rich, for example, if you're just not using the most adequate map, for example, you can use the contextual map that I presented just a moment ago. You can look if you can compare it with a navigation map on a ship or a geological map. If you use a geological map or a navigational map on land to, for example, find a Romanesque church, you will not find it using that map. And my invitation would be to start thinking about how do we create reality? What is the story that we are building? And one of the keys in letting digital transformation efforts succeed lays in how do we connect the different maps that we have on reality. In preparation of this session, I looked into a number of articles. To be honest, I was a bit lazy and I only downloaded 3 articles, of which I made a codification of 2 relatively recent articles addressing the same issue. Namely, how can you improve your digital transformation efforts? McKinsey gave the article the title Scaling and Accelerating a Digital Transformation, and PricewaterhouseCoopers had as a title Moving Beyond Digital Transformation and Improving the Return on Investment of Your Digital Transformation Initiatives. If you read the Pricewaterhouse article, basically the content of the article is transcending the models that you use in guiding your digital transformation efforts. If you read the McKinsey article is basically an interview with, and I have it here with me, with Mark Drasutis, a Chief Digital Transformation Officer of an insurance company. Well, I took the time. Both articles are equally long in length. They take about 3 pages. And I can codify the content of the articles in terms of what thought structures, which of the 4 categories of thought are used in the PricewaterhouseCoopers article. And what you see is that mainly contextual thought forms are used. Secondly, almost 1/3 process thought forms, but relationship thought forms and transformational thought forms are just absent, which is very peculiar because the focus of the Pricewaterhouse article is basically a summary of a study they did amongst more than 1,000 digital transformational efforts. And they only succeed in surfacing a number of categories. If you look at the McKinsey article, you see a different pattern, much more in equilibrium, but still a huge presence of contextual thinking within the article. But basically, all 4 thought structures are present in that article. And the presence of the different thought structures, ways of thinking, or you can say maps that you use to look at reality, we can say that the McKinsey article shows a higher fluidity of thinking than the PricewaterhouseCoopers article. Now, why is this interesting? A few years ago, I did a study on fluidity of thinking in annual reports of companies. The results are published in one of my previous books, Leadership, Minds Creating Values. The essence was that we looked at companies through 2 financial angles, a number of financial indicators referring to how a company captures value, is the current value creation. These are indicators such as the net operating profit after taxes per FTE, the net income per FTE, the gross margin per FTE, the EBIT per FTE. These are all variants of current value creation indicators. And the second set of indicators on the horizontal axis was the creating value indicators or the future value indicators. Examples of those indicators were the evolution of the enterprise value versus the estimated EBITDA for the next 12 months. Another indicator could be the average return on investment per FTE. That's a proxy. Another can be the price earnings multiple of companies. These are all indicators used by financial analysts. They do not come from me, but they allowed us to look at the history, the evolution of those indicators over a period of several years. And we selected from 3 different reporting areas the United States, the Far East, Japan and Asia, and Europe. Why those three? Because the norms in annual reports of what you disclose are simply different. And you can look at the forward-looking statements. These are hypotheses on the future in each of these annual reports, and you can codify them. Well, what was the result? If we look at the average fluidity score of low growth companies, it's about 26.8%. The sustainable growth companies, so these are companies who are doing better over a long time, have a much higher fluidity score compared with the low growth companies. And we compared companies that were in equal sectors and in equal size. So there is something about fluidity of thinking that we need to look into. And let me explore this now a bit further. What do I mean by developing your fluidity of thinking? That's basically becoming conscious about how the maps that you are using determine how you create the problem space and the solution space, how they influence how you are creating strategy. And that goes over a number of questions that you ask. Basically, we confuse two things if we deal with reality. Namely, the first question is, does what I think represent reality? If we look at the frameworks I shared, for example, is this a framework representing reality? Or is this a framework that allows me to create a hypothesis on reality? It's important to make the difference between the two. And we use a lot of language to create hypotheses for ourselves on how reality functions. But the basic mistake that we make is that we confuse our hypothesis with the reality that we are addressing. Let me explain that. So we can think about digital transformation through a number of thought structures. And the first thing that you look into, if you address either the bigger picture, the structural aspects of reality, or the process aspects of reality, or the relationship aspects of reality, or the transformational aspects of reality, that is, that you differentiate. And you differentiate in context the different parts, but always in the sense of relating those parts to a larger whole. A question you can ask, for example, is, well, how do I see digital transformation as part of a larger whole, with a focus on its contribution of the whole? If you look at the right and re-investigate the cognizant model, you can ask yourself the question, well, how are the processes and functions in the operating model really contributing to the market model, really contributing to the larger whole of the business model? And can I make those relationships explicit? It's the question of how are things functionally organized within the model that you're using. The second question of differentiation is, well, how are each of the elements in a process of change. How are they dynamic? Data and insights, for example, is continually changing. People and culture are continually changing. Value propositions are changing. If we build our digital transformation on the current value proposition without thinking through how our value proposition is changing and whether our future value proposition will shift our business model or not, we might end up in a digital transformation of the past without previewing or anticipating enough on the future. So process thinking is the second type of thinking that enables you to ask a whole bunch of different questions related to how things are changing and what is the dynamic of change that we take into account. If you look at the cognizant model, well, it's something you need to be aware of, that the process thinking is in the representation of cognizant absent. Relationship thinking is about the relationships between two or more separate elements. It might be that in certain industries, for example, in Belgium, the healthcare sector, well, that you need to consider the relationships with a whole new healthcare system that is introduced by the government, which forms a larger layer, and you cannot discuss or elaborate on the business model without knowing how or forming hypothesis on how the healthcare sector is evolving. I was last week in a very old industry, the metal working industry. Well, that's also shifting due to different types of regulations on emissions, on materials recycling, and so on. So relationship thinking is putting together things where you are convinced that you need to see them in their relationship. That's basically the basic form of that's the basic thought structure of relationship thinking. Transformation, the fourth thought structure category, is that you're able to differentiate the conflicting elements leading to the transformation or destruction of a system. For example, in that picture of cognizant, it does not inform you which limits you're confronted with. Limits in the middle office, limits in the front office, legacy limits. It can be hundreds of different limits, and how those limits can function as a kind of a motor of development of digital transformation. That's the first layer of differentiation you can make to enrich this model of cognizant, but you can enrich almost every model presented, stated in a different way. You can, even when you have a new consultant coming in your company, or there is a beautiful new model published in MIT, the Harvard Business Review, the Sloan Management Review, or Strategy and Business, given the thought structures, you can immediately identify what is absent in the model, And digital transformation will succeed better if you address what is absent in the models and is essential for your business. So you have no other choice than to always adapt any model you can find on the internet or in handbooks. It's even the case for the SAFe 5.0 model, which is a beautiful structural model, but does not inform you a lot about process, relationship, or transformational issues. It gives you quite a clear picture, basically, on how things could be organized in a structural way. But if you do not address the 3 other thought structure categories, you may work on a very fragmented view of perspective you have on the reality. So what I now did is exploring how you can go from context over process to relationship to transformation. That's what Otto Lasker called the breadth first search. Otto Lasker is one of the originators of this approach. You can also go deeper, and that's going from differentiation to elaboration and to integration. Let me illustrate this. So we have again the same model. We already explored the first question, but there are many differentiation questions. For example, you can also ask as a differentiation question in the bigger picture, what are the aspects of the competitive environment that might enable or impede my digital program? That's also a differentiation question. An elaboration question is really diving a bit deeper and looking at the structural, the functional, or the layered nature of reality. If you look at customer intimacy, there are probably layers in that. Customer intimacy is not a straightforward concept. In people and culture, what are the layers that are important in people and culture? What are the different layers in systems and technology? That's what we call elaboration of the context. That means that you elaborate how the elements form part of a functional whole or a kind of a hierarchy. A lot of digital transformation efforts fail because they neglected the stratified nature of the client reality. They neglected the stratified nature of a company culture. The third, if you go do the deep dive, is about integrating the different elements and perspectives into a structured, bigger entity as a kind of a system. So here you can, for example, ask, what are the different lines of interpretation from different contexts for the team of digital transformation? And how can I integrate these perspectives? For example, a perspective on sustainability, on reducing emissions, can be relevant to take into account. So you can have a deep dive in the structural side. You can also have a deep dive in process. A deep dive in process, well, starts with differentiation. Alternative differentiation questions could be, for example, what are the business trends emerging that I need to take into account? Or what might be the relationships between people that are evolving or that need to evolve in order to let digital transformation succeed. These are all variants of differentiation questions. That's building insight into how elements can change, linking current states to the past and the future, eventually rethink your perspective on the past to shape new possibilities in the present, or rethink your perspective on the future to build different opportunities in the present. Elaboration is addressing the issue of patterns in interaction. It's about elaborating how one or more elements evolve in their developmental aspects. For example, how do I recognize how my thinking about digital transformation adapts to my experience and thereby bringing new realities into being? I've seen plenty of digital transformation efforts fail because people were not aware that the first efforts in digital transformation reshaped basically their perspective on digital transformation and their possible options. And I've seen even enterprise architectures change over the course of digital transformation projects. So being aware of how things evolve and interact and what patterns are essential is an essential subject to talk about. You can think about collaborative intelligence as a way of addressing subjects in the digital transformation field in the most rich way as possible. And that can happen by, for example, reviewing milestones through these kinds of questions. You can do the same for the relationship category of thinking, or the relationship maps. It starts with differentiations of relationships, and it goes further to what are the structural aspects of a relationship and how can you elaborate the specific relationships between interconnected elements. It always fascinates me if you ask the simple question, help me understand how specifically this influences our value proposition, will influence how we will increase our market footprint. I'm always fascinated by how, by the silence that follows after such a question, because it is something they do not think through. They take it as a given that there is a relationship, but it is not made explicit how things can go both ways. How, for example, a focus on a certain indicator in one domain influences the indicator at the other domain, and vice versa. How things can go both ways. And the third layer or submap within the relationship category of thinking structures is the integration of interconnected elements and their constitutive relationships into an entity as a system. There are prior relationships to, for example, digital transformation. How do I point to relationships that are internal and intrinsic to the issue of digital transformation? For example, issues of losing one's identity. I've seen in a insurance company how the claims department merged with the sales department from the point of view that digitally a client should have one contact point throughout the customer journey. It was not taken into account how that what was necessary in identity development for people to make that happen. And the effort mainly failed just because they did not take into account that intrinsic relationship. What type of intrinsic relationships are essential in your business? That I cannot answer. I can only point to the power thinking in terms of thought structures might have and might do to your business. Thinking about digital transformation brings you into a fourth class of maps that you can use. All maps that help you think about how the form can change. I already made explicit the differentiation. If you would apply that on an individual level, the differentiation question, it could sound like, well, what aspects of yourself do you need to transcend in order to make digital transformation happen in your area of responsibility? Or what conflicts might emerge and need to be overcome when systems and processes that were once separated are brought together. These are all examples of differentiating questions within the transformation domain. Elaborating means that you go deeper into the conflicting interactions between the elements, and you can, for example, evaluate digital transformation systems in terms of their inclusiveness, in terms of their differentiation, degree of integration, or new equilibrium that they can create. So you're having a deep dive into the potential. Integration then means, well, how do I convey that two or more systems or frameworks could be coordinated and create the digital transformation? Within the first 100 models that I found on Google when I searched for digital transformation frameworks, I did not find one framework that addressed the transformational thinking thought structures. So we are talking a lot about transformation, not having a clue that we haven't thought through what we mean by transformation in terms of creating a different form and what it takes to create a different form. What we assume is that if we think together about digital transformation, what we assume is that everybody has a piece of the jigsaw puzzle. And the essential challenge of thinking together about digital transformation is putting the pieces of the puzzle together. Well, that's a huge underestimation of the challenge, because what we know is that the fluidity of thinking is different, and the different pieces of the puzzle have a different size. You can't fit in an easy way those pieces together into a puzzle. It simply is not helpful to keep on talking and defending your point of view. You will have to ask questions to look at the common ground between the different pieces, and so start to, well, find out where you can meet and how rich the complete picture is that you can build. Because we know that every person has its unique set of combination of thought structures. Every participant has a different fluidity of thinking. And what happens in groups when we think together, that is that a downward or an upward divided dynamic can occur. That means, by this I mean that, you know, the people having a more narrow perspective on digital transformation, for example, those who primarily think in terms of different categories, so in terms of structure or context, dominate the discussion and narrow the discussion basically to the roadmap and the steps and the milestones in the roadmap, without thinking through the specific processes, without thinking through relationships, without thinking through real transformational aspects. And at another moment in working together, the other subgroup that, for example, tends to a more fluid way of addressing things dominates the dialogue. And so in each thinking together exercise, you have kind of a struggle between subgroups favoring narrow thinking without being conscious that they are doing so, because that's not always intentionally, versus the subgroup who demonstrates a more fluid thinking. And what happens if the more fluid thinking subgroup feels not listened to? Well, they often put themselves in the background and wait, because they see where the efforts will fail, and they wait for their moment, because they think in terms of process, they think in terms of failure, they think in terms of relationships, and they are patient. And so a lot of energy of investment is lost. A lot of energy, time, budget, whatever is lost when you do not succeed to integrate, to address issues from the most richest perspective possible. Now, what can you do? It speaks a bit for itself that the first step is becoming aware of your own thinking. And besides looking at the contextual elements that you take into account in speaking about digital transformation, for example, the element of technology, the element of processes and systems, the element of data that you need, that you start to create an awareness of, well, you know, what kind of thought structure am I using when I'm building this argument? And that gradually you start to experience thinking together with others. The magical question when you start learning about thought structures is, well, can we spend a moment of thinking together about how we think about this issue? So it's all about finding a moment to take a meta perspective. But that requires 3 key attitudes. It's leaving behind the assumption that given arguments are true. No, given arguments always follow the thought structure that at that moment certain people or yourself are using. The second attitude is, well, you need to focus on the stream of thoughts in the team and make those an object of reflection. So that means that you are able to make the difference between talking about customer intimacy and the different customer journey points, for example, or if you talk about the business model, that you make the distinction between different channels, different client segments, the value proposition, the income stream. These are all content elements, and at the other side, how you are thinking about that content. If I'm thinking about a client segment, well, in which larger whole is that client segment embedded? Can I specify the relationship? If we talk about different client segments, are they part of a larger whole, or do they form the larger whole of something underneath? So that you start to think about how you are thinking about client segmentation or about whatever variable, dimension, or issue or problem that you're thinking about. And the third attitude is that you attach value to the reflection process rather than being fixated on the outcome. A lot of dialogue in companies gets woven from the table, gets pushed from the table by a fixation on the outcome. The more you get fixated on the outcome, the less probable it becomes that you will, well, be able to deliver the outcome. I had once in my career the time to work for a certain period together with Norton and Kaplan, who became very famous with their work on the balanced scorecard. So the balanced scorecard is a tremendous useful tool to focus your attention on outcomes, on indicators that matter, and even on building relationships between indicators. But well, in their research, even 15 years after they published their first book on the balanced scorecard, they still found out that more than 70% of the indicators, the desired outcomes, were never met. And when I asked them, well, but how much time do you spend about reflecting on how you reflect about the outcome? Well, it was silent. They did not spend a lot of attention to it. They spend attention on the content of the outcome, but not on how we might think about the, how we are thinking about the content of the outcome, which is a different level. At the team level, intelligent collaboration means that you have basically 4 mindsets to action planning. A focus on the fact that everything is part of a larger structure or multiple perspectives. Earlier this week, I had a conversation on a employee questionnaire that would be sent out. and it was very clear that every question was chosen making abstraction even of the bigger picture the company is operating into. And when I asked a bit further, well, it became very clear that most of the questions in that employee commitment questionnaire simply did not make sense, because they would not enable the team to build focused actions on the relationships between that issue and the bigger picture. Process thinking is a second mindset to action planning, which is focusing on what constantly moves or what is emerging. Relationship thinking is focusing on the common ground and the connection, and not taking the espoused relationships for granted. Just ask the question, help me understand the relationship, and that's often sufficient to induce to start relationship thinking. Transformational thinking is, well, it can help here to focus on radical change, and from the radical change focal point, identify the conflictual areas where things really need to change form. Change form is the essential of transformational thinking, while process thinking is thinking about how and what are you leaving behind. Most step plans, most roadmaps do not include process thinking. They are purely examples of structural thinking. Why is that? Because in the roadmap, there is no attention to what is here, what is it that we are leaving behind? What is the new thing that is emerging? It simply freezes variables into a step plan, which of course makes the roadmap, if process thinking, if relationship thinking, and if transformational thinking is absent from roadmaps, well, you have kind of a car with 3 wheels. You will never succeed in winning a race with a car with 3 wheels, or even 1 wheel, only the structural thinking wheel. On the organizational level, you have an opportunity to change the dialogue spaces. You have an opportunity to change the artifacts, to adapt the frameworks, the models, and the templates that are in line with and complement and enrich the fluidity of thinking that is already there in the organization, but that might be fragmented. It often doesn't make sense to shift to a new framework if SAFe 5.0 doesn't work. Well, let's go to the next framework. That doesn't make sense. SAFe 5.0 is basically a powerful framework, but feel free to complement it with process thinking, with relationship thinking, and transformational thinking, and suddenly you will discover the initial framework as developed 2 decades ago by the Toyota Group. SAFe 5.0 is basically an oversimplification of a very rich thought framework that was developed within the Toyota Group. You can also look at role and role-role relationships. I will not go deeper into those issues because they were part of my previous talk in November. I think you can still download that presentation. or listen to it. What is a powerful tool here to change the dialogue spaces? That's the rethinking game, which is a collection of about 12 questions per thought form subgroup. So what I mean is 12 questions. So for the relationship part, you have 3 times 12 questions. For the transformational part, you have 3 times 12 questions, and they allow you to start working, start enjoying the power of expanding the thinking, addressing issues which are difficult to solve in your company. So the game, also the other books, are available on my site. If you would be interested in learning more, I have a meta thinking program which will shortly start, and we will spend a half day on each thought form class. So a half day on structural or contextual thinking, half a day on process, half a day on relationship, half a day on transformational thinking, and one session that brings it together, and one introductory session, which goes a bit deeper than the session today. So this was my introduction. I think we have time for questions. I assume I saw that there was a lot of activity in the chat. Perhaps
absolutely, absolutely, and actually a lot of activities. What I really enjoyed was that people connected to help each other to map what you said. For example, giving the right naming about all the people that you mentioned, some references across the web. Actually, there is a question from Maru that had to drop off. And he's asking, I wonder, where do human beings fit in this model with this 2 dimension of enterprise transformation? It was related to something that you show.
Isn't the essence of a human being the thinking he or she engages in? It's the awareness that the essence of being human is the awareness about how you construct your reality.
Yeah, I think that the question
beings from the different thoughts structure categories also. For example, if I think about myself, I can ask, well, what are the larger wholes I'm part of as a human being? What are the larger wholes that give significance to my existence as a human being? So the human being is everywhere in this approach.
I think that maybe Maru was referring to the role in the third perspective that you mentioned. Okay. And we as an actor, I mean, we should be meta thinker, okay, because we have to think the way we are thinking. But probably the question could be, what is the role of we as a human when we are involved in this process? I mean, have to be active or passive or whatever.
Well, no, the most challenging thing that you can do is becoming a critical facilitator. That means that you observe what thought structures are used in a dialogue and ask the questions to let the other thought structures enter the dialogue. That's the essence of a critical facilitator. That's building your interventions on the observation of how poor or how rich the thinking unfolds in a real-time dialogue. And that's where you make most of the difference. You don't make a difference by demonstrating how much you know or how sophisticated your model is. Most sophisticated models are purely contextual models or functional models.
Okay. Thank you, Jan, for the response. Now you can open your microphone. So if you have question for Jan, I mean, I think now we can have an open session. So feel free to jump in the conversation. Well, just okay. I try to break the ice. One of the points that I really enjoyed in your presentation, Jan, is when you mentioned that actually all the framework available on the market are underestimating the transformation dimension. So they have a model, but actually they don't tell you how to move to this model. Do you think that in future we will have, let me say, some different perspective that on this existing framework? So you mentioned SAFe, for example. No? Now, from SAFe 4 to SAFe 5, we have this big change of the new perspective to see the framework, not only as a structure at the organization level, but also as a collection of competencies and skills to do something. Okay. Do you think that in future that we move to create more knowledge around the way to do the transformation, or they are still focusing on the final results of the transformation?
I think currently it's still focusing too much on the dimensions and the structure. But the future, to be honest, is a future where you have, where we will evolve in our capability to transcend, to include different perspectives. And in order to do that, it's becoming more conscious, and becoming more conscious is increasing the awareness of how you construct your own reality together with others. So the future is not in another model. Yeah? If you visit the pyramids in Egypt, you find plenty of models on the walls. Some models are from all times. There is nothing new in another article that presents another structural model. The challenge is in how does my thinking relate to that model? How is my thinking narrowing the potential of the model presenting? And how is my thinking or our collective thinking enriching the model presented? That's where, for me, the next stage is.
Thank you. I'm taking notes. Okay, I have my notepad, so sometimes I move to taking notes. Okay, thank you, John. Any more question? Okay, we have some notes. Okay, great quote. The future is not another model from Russ. Okay.
May I ask a question to the public?
Absolutely.
What is the one message that you will remember from this talk?
If you can open your microphone and tell.
Yeah, for me, Jan, the 4 dimensions that you've presented for digital transformation, I thought that was really good. 4 different ways of looking at the same thing. I like that.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it's simpler than the last time I heard you speak at SIO. It seemed very, very complex. This was easier to understand.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, from my side, as I already mentioned, I mean, my question was exactly on this, the fact that actually the models are underestimating the transformation dimension.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And we have another comment, reflecting on reflection. This is from Amit.
Yeah. Any other?
I also want to add something. For me, the most thing I remember is that whenever you go into a participation or a discussion about a certain topic with somebody, you always have to take into account that you are operating from different levels or might be operating from different levels. And therefore, it is not so easy for the other person to comprehend maybe the things you are thinking and the way you are seeing things.
Yeah. And that becomes even more difficult when you're trying to explain. If you look at the balance in meetings between explaining and asking, we tend to over-focus on explaining what we mean. And in our explanation, we confuse that reality is something that we construct. So the other, it's much more helpful to understand from what thought structures the other thinks in order to build a common ground. Mm-hmm. It will be much more difficult if you have well, if you stay on the content level.
Okay, thank you.
Great.
Any other insights?
Hi, Jan. I've got an insight. This was titled Digital Transformation Through Collaborative Intelligence. Yes. I don't think it needs the word digital. I just think it's transformation. I think this approach would work with any transformation.
That's correct.
I obviously for the audience, digital's a good route in, but it just it resonates just as it is. I think just for transformation in general.
You can change the word digital by events, by situations, by challenges, by problems, by whatever you like. It's what I did is show that there is a way to think differently about any subject. I'm not an expert in digital transformation. I'm not an expert in anything almost, but what I experience when I meet clients, and when I meet clients for the first time, that those clients are amazed by how much in-depth knowledge I have from their situation. And afterwards, the moment we have built a relationship, I say, to be honest, this is the first company in this sector that I'm working for. The only thing that I'm doing is listening to what you are not thinking about yet, and I'm asking questions on that. And that opens your mind. And if we would succeed in opening one another's minds more often, we will not fall into the polarization we experience in society daily. If we would invest a little bit of our time in learning to dialogue in the sense of the old Greek, which is an exploration of minds. That's what basically dialogue means in Old Greek. If we would invest in exploring one another's minds, I think about 80% of the problems have the potential of being solved much quicker, much simpler, with less effort, etc.
Thank you. Great comment, Stephen. However, great comment. Completely agree. This is about transformation, not only digital.
Yeah.
Any understanding problem is worth the activity? Yes, always. Okay. Any more comments? Okay. Okay. Thank you, Jan. Thank you for the sharing. Like the November's event, this was really interesting. I took a lot of notes that I'm going to use in future in my job. The video will be available. I don't know when. Actually, you know that my prediction on availability of video is always fake. But however, stay tuned. If you want to register in the YouTube channel, I put the link in the chat, so you will be notified when the video will be available. Next event actually will be on March the 2nd, but next week we are going to do a rush ticket for a complimentary ticket for AgiNext. We'll put the reference to the event so you can register. So it's a first come, first take. So when we open the event, the first registration will take the ticket. Anyway, we have a discount. I already put on the chat, but you can find this in the event for the raffle. So thank you all for joining. It was a great session. We were a lot, and this was really active on the chat. So thank you all of you for joining and participate, actually, not being just as a spectator, but as an actor for that. Okay, see you next event. Stay tuned and take care. Stay safe in these times, okay?
Yeah, and thank you, Corrado, for the opportunity to be invited and share some ideas.
My pleasure, let me say, but I think it was really worthwhile for everyone. Thank you for sharing, Jan.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.